Okay. Procrastination, right? Procrastination is when you delay doing something, even though you know you'll be worse off for delaying it. Okay, so we're going to get into the neuroscience and psychology of procrastination to understand why we engage in this, seemingly irrational habit, right? So first, let's begin. Let's talk about some of the psychology of procrastination, and then later I'll talk about the what's known about the neuroscience, at least some of the more prominent findings. And so throughout this section on psychology, I'll be kind of heavily relying on a highly influential 2014 review of procrastination by the psychologists Alexander Rozental and Per Carlbring. And if you want to look at that, there is it's in the sources in the description below. It's source number 1. So that's not the only study I'll be relying on, but it is a really helpful one, really informative, and still relevant, even though it's about 10 years old now. So here, first I want to note that all of us, right, all of us procrastinate on occasion, but for some people, this can become kind of a chronic, persistent behavior that can affect many areas, maybe all areas of their lives. And I just did an episode of the Social Brain podcast with Taylor Guthrie, my co-host on that show, about ADHD. And we talked a little bit about procrastination being sort of a common feature of ADHD. But today I'm talking mostly about, those of us who procrastinate kind of sometimes or every now and then, and just talking about it as a general phenomenon. But I will first, let me just talk about some of the kind of statistics about what we know about how common it is, right? So this is kind of based on that 2014 review, some of the findings that they cite there, but a large number of people procrastinate on a regular basis. And it's difficult to get exact statistics on this because a lot of this comes from self-report studies, asking, do you procrastinate often? You put things off, the other questions that get a little deeper into it, but ultimately it's often on these self-report measures because it's hard to do really controlled studies on how many people in the population actually procrastinate and in what areas and all that. But the self-report studies have found that around 15 to 20% of adults and as much as 50% of students, right, high school, college students, procrastinate to the point that it causes distress or other difficulties, right? Causing distress or other difficulties. So it's becoming like a problem, right? And again, that's based on self-report. So these numbers may not be completely accurate, or they may have changed too in the last 10 years. And that's interesting because actually some studies have indicated that the rates of procrastination may have increased between the 1970s and the 2010s. And if that's true, right, perhaps that has something to do with, our smartphones, right? These things. We have more readily available sources of distraction, smartphones, internet, that can take us away from sort of what we should be doing and distract us into something else. So sort of making procrastination maybe more easily accessible in some ways. But again, these are kind of inexact measures. But to get a little bit deeper into what's going on with procrastination, one really interesting correlation is that procrastination shows a negative correlation with age. So that means as we get older, we tend to procrastinate less. And I think that makes some intuitive sense, and it makes sense to some extent neurobiologically, right? So one explanation for this that's offered is that our brain's cognitive control networks that really rely on sort of the lateral prefrontal cortex, these areas that are involved in planning, in inhibiting impulses, in following rules in order to achieve goals, this doesn't become fully mature until our mid-20s, about age 25, right? It doesn't become fully myelinated. The fibers that carry information in the prefrontal cortex aren't fully insulated, so to speak, until our mid-20s. And so those kinds of executive functions, right? Inhibiting impulses, enacting plans, following rules, they're an important buffer against procrastination, against that urge to put off until later what might be better done now. So that makes some sense, right? As we go from childhood to mid or young adulthood, we reduce our tendency to procrastinate simply because we have this stronger executive function, more mature prefrontal cortex, cognitive control networks, that sort of thing. However, why would it past age 25, why would we continue to see this negative correlation with age? And that's not fully worked out as far as I understand, but there are some theories, some ideas based in psychological theories, and some researchers, some psychologists point out that as we age, right, our conception of the value of time changes. So as we get closer to the end of our life, we may realize that there's just less time to put things off. That could be one explanation for why this negative correlation continues in adulthood. Now, getting a little bit deeper into procrastination itself, right, we should notice that procrastination usually involves choosing an immediate reward or kind of an escape from an unpleasant experience, right, over and above long-term payoffs. An immediate reward as opposed to long-term payoffs. It's a choice where we value the present more than the future. Or at the very least, procrastination involves an implicit assumption, right? Unconscious assumption that by putting off the task until later, we're gaining some sort of value in the here and now, right? And as I noted at the beginning, right, procrastination also involves that recognition that we're kind of hurting ourselves by doing that. We're not helping ourselves by by delaying this task. We kind of know that, at least implicitly. We know the quality of our work or the experience of kind of anxiety associated with that task hanging over our head will be there, right? We'll have lower work quality, lower, you know, the quality of our work will be lower, and we might have this anxiety, this worry about this stuff hanging over our head. But I think just from a sort of a layperson perspective, procrastination may not always be a conscious choice, right? There's some wishy-washy thinking, some cognitive biases there that we may not be aware of, right? It could result from like automatic habits, from some of these, like I said, some of these cognitive biases, and I'll discuss some evidence for that later on. But in general, I think most of us understand that procrastination, when we're doing it, is a suboptimal strategy, right? Um, Now that seems fairly obvious. That's again just sort of digging into the definition and the pattern of procrastination, if you will. But something about procrastination that is somewhat surprising is that it's not only bad for our productivity, but it's also associated with poorer health, poorer work performance, and finances, right? And those last two kind of make sense, right? Performance at work and finances, you could see why procrastination would affect those. But health, I think, takes a little bit more explanation. And one sort of obvious cause of that might be that, if you're procrastinating a doctor's visit, right, or alternatively an appointment with like a therapist or a mental health professional, that could compound existing problems, right? If you're waiting to go to the doctor when you have some, something, say a mole on your body or something that you need to get checked out, that could make that problem worse if you procrastinate it for too long, right? And similarly with mental health, right? If you're depressed, if you're having serious, chronic anxiety or whatever that issue may be, if you're not reaching out for help, if you're just putting that off and off and off, it can compound those problems. And that makes sense, right? That's sort of like, if your car, you notice a weird sound with your engine in your car, and you're like, I'll just put it off. I'll just wait. And then eventually the engine falls out and everything, there's a catastrophe, right? You kind of kicking yourself because you should have gone early. You procrastinated. But there's also an effect on health that there was a 2022 meta-analysis that looked at this idea of sleep procrastination. So putting off sleep, right? And we all know, maybe we see it in ourselves or other people who do this, right? We all see this. It is very easy to just want to stay up a little later. It's much easier to stay up later than it is to get up earlier. But interestingly, this study found that sleep procrastination, of course, is associated with shorter sleep duration, right? That's pretty obvious, makes sense. But also lower sleep quality, right? And that makes sense if you know anything about kind of the biology of sleep. If you don't go to bed at the same time every night, you tend to kind of screw up the natural pattern of brain activity that is occurring in sleep, such that you don't get the same restorative processes, the same quality of sleep that you would. So there's these kind of unexpected or just unintuitive facts about just putting off sleep. So that's just one example of a specific health behavior that when we procrastinate it can lead to, health problems or just at least fatigue and issues associated with poor sleep. So, okay, so that's just to highlight this idea that procrastination, delaying tasks, right? It isn't just about missing deadlines. It's not just about having poor performance at work, but it affects our health, our wallet, right? Our happiness. And specifically, another example is when it comes to schoolwork, when it comes to studying, right? We all know that waiting until the last minute and sort of cramming for the exam, that creates a stress cycle. And we know through studies on learning that it is just a very ineffective strategy to try to just shove all this information into your brain at once. And it impacts not only our grades, but like our peace of mind, right? I knew this in high school. I was a terrible procrastinator in high school. I would just wait until the very last minute to do whatever it was, my homework. Sometimes I wouldn't even do my homework. Or I'd wait until the day of the test to study. Luckily I got that under control in college and totally changed that. And it totally changed my grades and my feelings about school and made me just feel a lot more peace of mind and confidence. And that sort of gets into this idea of self-esteem and confidence and how procrastination can have this negative effect on our sense of self-efficacy. And actually, there are studies showing that both self-esteem and self-efficacy show negative correlations with procrastination. That means that if you have a positive self-image and a belief in your ability to get things done, you're less likely to procrastinate. And so this can be kind of explained by a theory in psychology known as self-efficacy theory, which argues, right, on this point that low self-efficacy, right, this would be, if you believe statements like, I've failed before, so why should I even try? This is too hard. I'm never going to make it. Those kinds of sort of self-defeating beliefs that indicate a low level of self-efficacy. You don't believe in your ability to get things done. Kind of some ways, a lack of confidence, right? This leads to engaging in an activity with less effort and often at the last minute, right? It leads us to it's this belief, right? It's this belief leading to low performance and poor results. So And then it doesn't stop there, right? Because the poor results, the poor performance is evidence that feeds into our sense of self-efficacy. It supports those sort of self-defeating beliefs. And then again, that helps to lead to poor performance and results. So this is just highlighting one of the powerful ways that our beliefs, right, can affect our behavior, which then feed back the results of that behavior feeds back on those beliefs. So this can create, right, a vicious cycle, and it makes us not only unproductive but unhappy, right? We're not confident. We tend not to be as happy as we could be. So to interrupt that cycle, right, it's important to address both those beliefs and the behaviors. You have to begin to reverse that cycle by reminding yourself that success is possible for you, and then setting up habits that make that success more likely. So in this video, this live stream, I'm talking pretty much only about sort of the science, what is procrastination, whether in our minds and our brains. But in my upcoming kind of explainer video, I will be talking about 6 evidence-based tools for beating procrastination. These are based in neuroscience and psychology, and that'll be coming out, I think, next week. So stay tuned for that if you want some real actionable steps. Now, another protective factor, in addition to self-efficacy and that sort of confidence I mentioned, has to do with motivation. And this one makes a lot of sense. When we're intrinsically motivated to do a task, we are less likely to procrastinate. This makes a lot of sense. So intrinsic motivation refers to the motivation for the kinds of tasks that we find value in for their own sake. So the kinds of things that we like to do without having to be rewarded or prodded, right? So you might love, just pulling some examples out of nowhere, like mountain biking, or maybe you're a math person. Maybe you love math. Maybe you like doing, I don't know, expense reports or something, like whatever. Maybe those are not great examples, but we can all think of things that we do for their own sake that we love to do, right? And we don't procrastinate on those things. We typically don't anyway. And of course, while some tasks are simply less exciting than others, we don't intrinsically enjoy them as much. In that video I mentioned, that upcoming video, I'll explain how we can shift how we view individual tasks to sort of zoom out and see their larger purpose, and thereby enhance our intrinsic motivation to complete them. Again, that'll be in that upcoming video, so stay tuned for that. But another factor having to do with motivation is that people who have a high desire to be successful, kind of desire to achieve, to overcome obstacles, and in general to accomplish goals, are less likely to procrastinate. Right? I think we can all see, like, intuitively that makes sense. But just highlighting those motivational factors, I think, is important. Now, as we'll see when we get to the neuroscience of procrastination, recent studies, one recent study suggests that procrastination may result from a cognitive bias where procrastinators seem to implicitly and falsely believe that doing a task later will kind of be easier. And we'll talk about that. But also that it won't be much less rewarding, right? Easier and not much less rewarding if you do it later compared to now. So you can see how that sort of bias in cognition would lead to some procrastination. And it also reflects that idea that we're not always maybe fully conscious of the negative outcomes of procrastination. We kind of don't see that, yes, indeed, delaying this task will cause, distress and poorer results and things like that. Maybe it's just sort of that wishy-washy, fuzzy thinking I was talking about earlier, implicit, sort of unconscious thinking. Okay, so before we get to the neuroscience, I want to just quickly talk about an interesting, although I will have my critiques of it after I kind of give the outline of it. An interesting sort of evolutionary um, sort of explanation of procrastination, um, because in a strict sort of uh, somewhat naive, like Darwinian thinking, we might think, okay, procrastination is so bad, right? Why wouldn't evolution have just gotten rid of it or just plucked it out of our brains as soon as it caused a sufficient number of our ancestors to, forego those tasks that are related to survival and reproduction? Why wouldn't it have kind of been flushed out of our gene pool, so to speak? And I'll talk about sort of the genetics and stuff in a little bit, but one obvious answer, right, comes back to motivation, right? When we're highly intrinsically motivated to do something, we're less likely to procrastinate. And I don't know about you, but it's pretty hard to think of anything that's more motivating than just basic survival and reproduction, right? People tend to not need much uh, external reward to keep themselves alive and have sex, right? But that is, complicated by the fact that many tasks that were carried out by our ancestors, by our hunter gatherer ancestors, involved serious delayed gratification. And so they were not directly tied to survival or reproduction, right? So these might have included, storing food for the winter, taking time to craft like a better hand axe, right? Or walk for long distances to find a better place to live. These are all things that take effort. They take sort of investment of time and resources, and you don't see there's a risk associated with whether or not you'll even see a positive outcome from them. But evidently, right, they were able to do these things, or at least many of them were able to do these things without procrastinating. But the truth is, right, those tasks would really mostly only be adaptive if the environments that these ancestors inhabited were relatively stable. So, for example, it makes relatively little sense, makes basically no sense to store food for the winter if the climate is so unpredictable that you don't know whether you'll have food to make it through the month, right? So, if things are just changing constantly, it's hard to sort of make an argument for why you should store food. If you don't know if you don't know whether you're going to get through the day, why are you storing food for the next year, right? So again, I have my critiques of this, but some evolutionary psychologists have argued that procrastination may be beneficial in these kinds of situations, right? Pushing off that sort of delayed gratification. Uh, and that would help explain why we have, procrastination so common, 15 to 20% of adults in our modern world, right? Because most of our evolution was probably characterized by relatively stable environments, but there were, of course, periods of, unpredictability, of extreme uncertainty. And that could have lasted long enough to select for maybe some procrastination, some delayed, immediate reward over delayed gratification type of behavior. But in the modern world, right, especially in the developed world, we live in a very stable time. It's very easy to procure the basic necessities of life. So perhaps this tendency to procrastinate, a sliver of it, right, arises partly from the fact that many of our ancestors faced chaotic and uncertain times in which future planning was not as valuable. Now, I mentioned I have some critiques or just some questions about this kind of reasoning. Um, this comes partly from a 2016 study, right, which was published in the journal Evolutionary Psychology, that purported to support this idea by showing that students who were subjects, they were students who were less future oriented right? Less oriented toward the future, and who perceived the future as less predictable and stable were more likely to report that they procrastinated. Okay, I'm not an expert. I'm not an evolutionary psychologist. Um, but in my opinion, I think that it's a bit of a stretch to say that that explains the evolutionary origin of procrastination. I think it more reveals just it's very interesting because it reveals these cognitive factors that predict procrastination, right? If we're less future oriented, if we perceive the future as less predictable and stable, then we are more likely to procrastinate. And I don't want to like completely trash the study because there are other um, uh, some others indirect supports of this idea. But just in general, I've become somewhat skeptical of this kind of evolutionary account of specific behaviors like procrastination. Not because I don't believe in evolution. Of course, I do. I have multiple videos on the evolution of the brain, right? And I think evolutionary psychology does have a lot to offer. But I just think that, especially in this case, there's a lot, let's say, open to interpretation, right? Especially just that sort of cognitive interpretation I just mentioned. That being said, right, there does appear to be a genetic component or genetic correlation with procrastination. So, for example, identical twins are more likely to show similar levels of procrastination compared to non identical twins. And this is really not all that surprising. If you watched a long time ago, I had an interview with the eminent behavioral geneticist Robert Plomin, who I talked to about how basically every part of our psychology has some genetic component of that sort, where we can see identical twins showing more similarity than non-identical twins, and there's many more sophisticated ways of getting at that question. But even so, it seems that even the studies that show this correlation still note that it's not necessarily like we have. I mean, it's definitely not that we have genes for procrastination, right? That's kind of a wrong way to think about the behavioral genetics in general. But that rather that more basic cognitive traits like impulsivity or cognitive control in general would better account for that correlation. So identical twins are going to have more similar levels of impulsivity, of cognitive control measures, and so like that sort of thing would probably explain the genetic correlation with procrastination better than procrastination per se, but maybe that's just a sort of semantic thing. There is some kind of genetic component. Perhaps there was some evolutionary explanation for this. But if you find yourself procrastinating, don't blame it on your genetics. Definitely don't blame it on evolution. The truth is that procrastination is not a fixed personality trait. It's not hardwired into you, although there's true that some of us are, of course, naturally less likely to procrastinate. So there's a small component of that. But again, in my upcoming video, I'm going to talk about some strategies that should work for the vast majority of us to help us really clamp down on procrastination. I will admit, though, that there are conditions like ADHD, right, that are associated with procrastination that will make that harder, right? So I'm not denying that there's this biological component. And indeed, let's get into kind of some of the neurobiological explanations, some of the studies that have been done on procrastination. Now, to be honest, to be frank, the neuroscience of procrastination is a young area of study. And so reliable findings are somewhat hard to come by. And just in general, there's not a ton known yet about this, but there are some quality studies, especially in the last 8 years or so, 8 to 10 years, that have looked at some of the neuroscientific underpinnings of procrastination. So let's look at a couple of these that have been published in really high quality journals. And the first comes from it's a 2016 study that was published in the journal Scientific Reports, which is a publication of Nature, which is a very prestigious sort of publishing group. And it was a resting state fMRI study. So it used functional magnetic resonance imaging, right, to scan the brains of 132 Chinese students who, based on their self-reports, showed relatively high levels of procrastination. And it looked at them in the resting state. It wasn't that they were looking at them while they're procrastinating or anything like that. It was, okay, let's just look and see if there is a difference between the brains of these procrastinators compared to non-procrastinators or people who procrastinate relatively infrequently, right? At rest, what's going on in the brain. And I'm going to summarize this study, but there are some interesting sort of complication or some just nuances here, but I'm going to summarize what their major findings were. So this study found that activity in certain brain regions, especially the parahippocampal cortex and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, positively correlated with procrastination. So there was higher activity, higher resting state activity in the parahippocampal cortex and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex in people who report high levels of procrastination. While the anterior, the sort of lateral frontmost portion of the prefrontal cortex shows a negative correlation. And this makes a lot of sense, right? Okay, so first they discovered certain brain regions are more active in people who procrastinate, and certain areas are less active at rest in those same people who procrastinate. And in general, so the parahippocampal cortex and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex are involved in reward processing, in emotion regulation, in memory, and they showed greater activity. But the part of the brain, I think what's more relevant here, or maybe more intuitively impactful, so to speak, is that that lateral anterior prefrontal cortex was less active. And this region is the kind of main node of the cognitive control networks, or it is part of that system. It's an integral part of the cognitive control, the sort of executive function system of the brain, which again talked about earlier, is so involved in planning, in sort of inhibiting impulses, in rule-based behavior, in goal-oriented behavior, and it's less active at rest. And that's interesting, right? So just from the outset, we're seeing, okay, differences in the brains of people who tend to procrastinate and those who procrastinate less, right? And then the other major finding of this study was that procrastination or procrastinating, people who tend to procrastinate more show also a different pattern of functional connectivity between certain brain areas. So this is basically looking at if brain area A is active at the same time as brain area B, that can be interpreted as a positive functional connectivity between those brain regions. It doesn't mean that they're physically connected to each other, or at least directly, but it means that they have this functional connectivity. And so what they found was that there was a positive correlation, positive functional connectivity between that lateral prefrontal cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex, which is along the sort of midline, the middle of the brain, and the posterior cingulate cortex. Now, that's a lot of jargon there, but I'm going to try to break that down. And actually, this sort of general pattern is similar to findings in the brains of people with ADHD. And it is uncommon in sort of neurotypical people or people who don't procrastinate very often. This functional connectivity between these lateral prefrontal regions and these sort of more medial regions. Now, they also found that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, this is a region sort of on the kind of underside of the prefrontal cortex toward the middle, that it shows negative functional connectivity with several other brain regions. I'm not even going to mention those, but the VMPFC, one thing that it does is it's involved in decision making and controlling impulses and valuation, and it's not communicating as well with these other areas. But let me just talk about how the authors interpreted these findings, because I think it really clarifies all this jargon and everything I've just been saying. So they interpreted it by suggesting that procrastination may result from a failure, a sort of impairment of cognitive control, where the default mode network is hyperactive at a time when it, and in concert with this lateral prefrontal region, which is not the usual or the kind of optimal pattern of brain activity. So I mentioned before that there's this is similar to findings in ADHD. And this kind of goes to a larger discussion of brain networks. And if you want to get deeper into this, I have an episode of The Social Brain, the podcast I do with the neuroscientist Taylor Guthrie, where we talk about brain networks. And then we have one about ADHD where we get into that. But the basic idea is that this default mode network is really involved in thinking about ourselves, in sort of self-related processing, in thinking about our future, our past, who we are, what we value, and it's kind of active at our when we're not really doing anything at all. It tends to be more active. Whereas we have these cognitive control networks, these frontoparietal control systems that are active when we're engaged in a task that requires focused attention, that requires reasoning. So, when you're the way they found this was people in the brain scanner, when they weren't engaging in the kinds of cognitive tasks that the researchers were testing for, they found this common pattern of brain activity that was really centered on these midline prefrontal and sort of posterior regions, these kind of midline regions that, and it's a little more complicated than that, but those were dubbed, that network was dubbed the default mode network, right? And was subsequently found that it was involved in this sort of self-related processing. But the what they called at the time the task positive networks were these networks that were involved in cognitively engaging with a task that involved like sort of reasoning about things outside of oneself. And those those two networks, right, this frontoparietal control system and this default mode network, show what's called an anti-correlation. So when the default mode network is active, the frontoparietal control systems tend to be inactive. And then the opposite is the case. When the frontoparietal control systems are active, the default mode network is inactive, right? That's the kind of sort of optimal state brain network, the balance between those networks. And what's been found is that when that balance is upset, when that anti-correlation starts to degrade, right, when the default mode network starts to come online, when the frontoparietal control system is online at the same time, you get decrements, you get decreased performance on cognitive tasks, right? And you kind of can understand why that might be. If you're trying to pay attention to something that requires kind of like a lot of reasoning, abstract reasoning, a lot of focused attention, and you keep thinking about, what happened yesterday? What was I doing? Oh, shouldn't have done that. Or, oh, that was really fun. And like, it's now your attention is being pulled in multiple directions and you can't fully focus on what you're doing, right? So that would kind of reflect this default mode coming online at the same time as the frontoparietal control systems. And so in general, this study was finding something similar to that some of these main regions of the default mode network were active at the same time as this region, the lateral prefrontal cortex of the frontoparietal control system, were coming online at the same time to a greater extent in people who procrastinate than those who don't procrastinate. So it's just a kind of neurobiological, perhaps underpinning of some procrastination behavior, that it may have to do with this, almost the hyperactivity of the default mode network, hyperactivity of this self-related processing when it shouldn't be happening, if that makes any sense. And again, this is just one study, but it's a really interesting study published in a really high quality journal. So it's definitely worth paying attention to. And I probably didn't do all the findings justice. I know that was kind of a long-winded explanation of what was going on. But if you want to get deeper into that, you can check out, I think it's reference maybe number 5, source number 5 in the description. You can check out that study. Really interesting. Now, that was published in 2016. And the second study I want to mention was published in 2022. And I actually already talked about some of the findings of this study earlier. This was published in the journal Nature Communications, again, a very high quality journal. And it explored how procrastination is related to brain activity, right? Particularly focusing on a region called the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. Although the region that they labeled dorsomedial prefrontal cortex in other studies has been referred to as the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, which I'll talk about why I think that makes more sense if we label it as the ACC rather than the DMPFC. I'll talk about that in just a second. I know I'm throwing a lot of acronyms and jargon out there, but bear with me. So this region, whether we want to refer to it as the DMPFC or the DACC, it plays a role in making decisions. It plays a role in decisions that involve choosing between immediate and future rewards or effort. Right? I explained in a previous video how this region is involved in calculating effort, cost, and rewards of carrying out a given action. So they analyzed brain scans. And this study was interesting because it wasn't just self-report. They actually did a study where participants had to sort of weigh the value of rewards or effort against the delay, right? So it was like whether they would procrastinate or not in this sort of laboratory study. And they found that the DMPFC's activity was influenced by how much individuals valued time and effort. So they discovered that people's tendency to procrastinate was specifically linked to their brain's valuation of effort over time rather than to rewards or punishments. So how much how much importance the brain placed on the effort involved over time. So a stronger inclination to delay tasks, to procrastinate, right? As shown was shown to relate to these specific neural patterns in the DMPFC. And I don't want to get too far into that, but again, I mentioned earlier that the finding was that procrastination relates to this cognitive bias where delaying a task or where we place less, we believe implicitly see a task as being somewhat easier in the future, but not much less rewarding. And they found this was directly related to this activity in this dorsal dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, or what, in my opinion, looked more like the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. And again, I've explained how this region is involved in calculating effort, cost, and rewards of carrying out a given action. So that is fully consistent with the idea that the ACC plays a role in the decision and the tendency to procrastinate. Okay, so as you can tell, and as I mentioned earlier, this is a new area of neuroscience, and it's a complicated one. So it wouldn't surprise me if these findings were, modified or maybe even overturned or expanded in the years to come. But it does seem to indicate a kind of emerging picture of procrastination as resulting from perhaps a lack of cognitive control, kind of that hyperactivity of the default mode network, and underactivity of these frontoparietal control systems, and a pattern of brain activity consistent with high time preference, with that seeing efforts as kind of discounted over time. Having to do with these regions involved in cognitive control and in decision making, that all makes sense. But again, this all may not seem particularly helpful if you're trying to stop yourself from procrastinating. So I want to remind you to check out my upcoming video on how to overcome procrastination. Right? There will be actionable strategies based on the neuroscience of cognitive control, motivation, productivity, and even our personal values. So I'll be getting a lot more into the strategies and talking a little bit about this neuroscience here. But yeah, I wanted to give an overview of what procrastination is, how it works. And I hope that you have gotten something out of this discussion. So I know we covered a lot of ground. So I'm going to do a summary, a kind of in-depth summary of everything I just covered, so we can hit the main points and make sure that it's all kind of solidified in your mind. So we talked about the prevalence of procrastination, where a significant portion of adults and students procrastinate to the extent that it causes distress, with some self-report studies indicating that as much as 15 to 20% of adults and 50% of students procrastinate to the point that it causes distress. We saw that it may be increasing over time, the prevalence, especially from the 1970s to the 2010s, maybe due to more available distractions like our smartphones. But again, this is all based on self-reports, and more recent information may change our view of that. But we also talked about age and procrastination, that there's a negative correlation between age and procrastination, right? So as we get older, we tend to procrastinate less, possibly explained by the maturation of the brain's cognitive control networks, especially the lateral PFC, which matures around age 25. And that may enhance impulse control and sort of goal achievement capabilities. Also, that idea that as we get older, our conception of time may change, where we just see that there's just less time to put things off, right? We talked about immediate gratification versus long-term payoffs, where procrastination often stems from the sort of conscious choice of choosing immediate rewards over long-term payoffs, despite being aware that that delay can lead to lower quality work and increased anxiety. We talked about some of the negative consequences of procrastination, where it doesn't just affect our productivity, but our health, our performance at work, our financial outcomes, even our happiness. We talked about sleep procrastination resulting in shorter sleep durations and higher daytime fatigue and poorer sleep quality. We got into some of perhaps the psychological causes of procrastination, like self-esteem and self-efficacy, where there's the correlations between low self-esteem and low self-efficacy and procrastination. So low self-efficacy, right? Those doubts about our abilities, about ourselves, I failed before, so why even try? That can perpetuate a cycle of procrastination. poor performance and, further self-doubt, further lowering that self-efficacy through that spiral we talked about. We also talked about intrinsic motivation and the sort of desire to achieve as kind of motivational factors, where higher intrinsic motivation and a desire to achieve goals are protective against procrastination. So viewing tasks as valuable for their own sake, right? That intrinsic motivation can reduce our tendency to procrastinate. We mentioned this evolutionary perspective and cognitive biases, where procrastination might have been adaptive in certain circumstances. But we also talked about how that cognitive explanation, where if we're less future oriented, if we see the future as less predictable, we're more likely to procrastinate, kind of explains that as well. So we talked about some of the neural correlations with procrastination, especially that study where we saw that the hyperactivity of the default mode network may help explain the tendency to procrastinate. We talked about the study, the 2022 study that looked at the DMPFC, or perhaps the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex role in procrastination, finding that the tendency to procrastinate is linked to how this brain region is involved in the valuation of effort over time. And then we talked about how this is a new area of neuroscience, and so some of these findings may change over time or be expanded, or but that there is an emerging picture of how this is all shaking out. So again, I know this isn't a terribly actionable video, but I hope it gave you some insight into how procrastination works. And in my next explainer video, I will be talking about 6 steps to beating procrastination. And those are going to be really highly actionable, concrete things that you can do if you notice yourself procrastinating to enact in your life. And I really think that will be helpful. It's been helpful for me. So anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.